Shaders shouldn't be scary, and I want you all to use them more. Hi, my name's Hannah. I'm going to show you some art tricks that you might not know about. Learn how to ignore convention, do things your own way, work around limitations, and expand your artistic capabilities with this one simple trick. It's shaders. We're going to do a few things with shaders. First off, a little bit about me. Hi, my name's Hannah Grace. I also go by Cora because I am multiply neurodivergent, and that is a whole kettle of fish. I'm the art lead at Camshaft Software. I've been working on Automation, the car company tycoon game, for nearly 7 years now. It's a unique title with lots of player freedoms and creativity, but it also means it can be quite unwieldy to develop for, as some things simply have no definable shape. And so I have to find shader workarounds to make textures look right, or a lot of the time I simply can't use textures. So I'll find other ways of doing it, and hopefully I'll be able to share some of those ways with you today. A few takeaways from this talk: when and where you can ignore convention for artistic freedom. Sometimes the way things are done is not the best way to do things. Might be able to show you some of those. A few tips and tricks for optimizing some lesser known shaders. Sometimes you can do things in weird and wonderful ways that you might not expect. A few small shader things that you might not know about. Hopefully it'll make shaders a lot less daunting. At the end of the day, they're all just numbers. A few shader workarounds for when things have to change, but they also can't. Doing things in the shader means you can work around problems that would otherwise not be solvable. And lastly, just some cool things I've done. Hopefully they'll inspire you to delve into the art of shaders yourself and learn a thing or two. First example I want to show you: why use textures when simple math will do? I've got a scenario where I want to add unique detail to a few objects, but using textures for this would inflate the install size and possibly overload the player's video card. There's a few problems with using textures on our game. The increased asset creation overhead is a big one. We have a lot of content, thousands and thousands of unique meshes. If we had unique textures for those meshes, that is a vastly increased asset creation overhead. We've already got a highly specialized content workflow. Things have to be done in very specific ways, and adding more on top of that just makes things even more complicated. And because we have a vast amount of modders and contractors that we work with, it means there's an increased content variability between those creators. No one does things the same way, and it would require a lot of extra work to onboard everyone to make sure everything works exactly the same way, so we just don't do it that way. The other problem with textures is just sheer magnitude. As I mentioned before, we have thousands of assets. I did a calculation. If I just counted all of the different car bodies and fixtures that you can put on cars, things like headlights and grills and car seats and engine parts, we've got nearly 8,000 of them. I did some math. If we have a 1K texture for those assets, we've got an albedo, a normal map, and maybe a packed map that's got your metallic, roughness, and ambient occlusion masks. With DXT1 compression, the albedo and packed map would be 704 kilobytes each. The normal map, packed with BC5 compression, would be 1.4 megabytes. Now, on its own, that's 2.8 megabytes. per mesh, which doesn't sound like a lot until you remember that we have nearly 8,000 of them. If you multiply that out, it's over 21 gigabytes of storage, which is a lot for an indie title. A lot of us lament that AAA games are getting closer and closer to that 100 gigabyte mark. And imagine if an indie title you bought got that. We cannot afford that extra 20 gigabytes, so we don't do it. The solution for this, instead of using textures, is to have a shader that does it for us. And I'm going to show you what that looks like. We're going to make a grunge texture, and I'm going to show you how to add grunge to curved parts of an object and not the flat bits. Adds just a little bit of variability to the shader that makes materials look just a little bit more realistic. Jump over here, load up a model for you to see. Take a drink while this loads. Oh, I've gone to the wrong level. I want my face in there. There we go. That's better. Okay. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, because this is not the best example, but I'm going to come down here, and you see this color variation here, this light part, and then the darker parts over the wheel here? There's no unique texture for this mesh, no mask texture defining where should be, where grunge should be. If I go and tick some tick boxes here, I'll be able to start messing around with the mesh, and you can see just by adjusting the shape we now have much more of the dark patches here around the wheel. I can flatten that back down and it goes away. None of this is done with textures. Imagine if every single one of these adjustments that I can make to this car body was its own texture. That would be a very complicated shader. So instead, we don't do it with textures. I do this simply in the shader. And you can actually see over here some of the triangulation errors on this mesh, causing, I don't know, a believable amount of wear. It doesn't look great, but it doesn't look completely awful. Especially considering this is a car body with nothing on it. A much better example would be a car body that has something on it. I'm going to load up my test car body here. This is not the prettiest thing in the world, but it's not meant to be. And you can see on the top here, there's again some triangulation errors, but it adds just a little bit of wear that would otherwise not be there if I didn't have the shader, because again, I can't make unique textures for these. I'm going to go back into this one so I can show you how it can be adjusted. The wheel's another good example here. You can see it looks really good on here. Got some flat areas and some rougher areas here, and it just looks nicer. And if I go over here to look at all the different wheels we have, it doesn't seem like a lot, but this is one category. If I were to make a texture for all of these, it would absolutely bloat the amount of content that we have. We simply cannot do this with textures. There are just far too many objects. If I go over to the Paint tab, there we go, I can edit this paint. And I can show you what happens when I turn this part of the shader down. Wow, that's not working. Has that got a different one on it? This is not going well. There we go. Okay. So as you can see, this grime starts to happen just on the curved parts of the mesh. If I turn the game off, I have another level that shows this off quite nicely. Oop, where am I? I'm here. If I go to unlit mode, you can really see just how much extra variability it adds to the assets. And it's just done with a few sliders. Again, it makes content creation so much easier. I can even adjust how much of it exists on curved areas. Here it is on another mesh. Again, it just adds that little bit of extra detail that would otherwise not be possible. Again on this one. Doesn't quite work for some meshes, but that's okay. We can work around that. Once we have a base, we can do stuff with it. Here it is on another car body. This one looks a lot nicer, if I do say so myself. Go into unlit so we can see just the shader doing its work. It's an extra level of variability and detail that we wouldn't be able to do. And it's very simple. I'm going to show you how. If I go all the way up here, at the very start here, I'm just going to plug this value into base color. Hit the apply button. This is the mask that the shader makes. View it on some other meshes here. Just a little bit of variability. It's not perfect, but it doesn't have to be. Go back to the shader. All that's doing, this is just a number. This is just some math. The only inputs here is this. And I'll show you what these look like. This one here is a really fun one. The absolute world position. This node is effectively free for us because I'm using world-aligned textures over here, which, if I go up, already has the vertex normal, and it already has the world position. Where was I? Yeah, this one. So, this node's free, and this node's free. These nodes are very interesting. DDX and DDY. They stand for the derived data along the x-axis and the derived data along the y-axis. Because GPUs do things very interestingly. They don't actually calculate every single pixel on its own. They calculate them in chunks. And the DDX and DDY are the adjacent pixels. If you think of a 2x2 square, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, DDX is just the pixel horizontally next to the current pixel. DDY is the vertical pixel, and it's the difference between it. So the absolute world position is the world position of the current pixel. DDX is the world position of the pixel next to it. DDY, pixel above it. If you cross product those and normalize the result, you get a very interesting color Hit the apply button, wait for shaders. And this color is the face normal. So this is the object if it were flat shaded. No smooth edges. So if you're making a pixelated game, you can create hard edges without recreating the mesh. Simply by, let me bring this back up, there we go. Simply by getting the normalized cross product of the ddx and ddy of the absolute world position. An interesting thing here that we're doing to that, I pull this out, what I'm doing here, where's this line going? Let's go into base color. I'll turn that off just to make it a little bit more readable. What I'm doing here is a dot product against the vertex normal. This vertex normal is the smoothed normal, or, smoothed with hard edges, whatever the normal of the mesh is, basically. So if you compare the face normal, the hard-edged version of the mesh, against the smoothed version of the mesh, which is what a dot product is, you can compare to, it returns 1 if both of the vectors are pointing in the same direction, 0 if they're at a 90-degree angle, or -1 if they're pointing in exactly opposite directions. So if they're pointing it in the same direction, you get a value of 1. And the further away from each other they get, the closer to 0, and then the closer to -1 those values get. And the result of this is the difference between the face normal and the vertex normal. If I do a 1 minus on that, do a little bit of a power and a divide on it, all that does is make the value a little easier to see. Hit the apply button again, and there's the result. All this is showing me how different the face normal is to the vertex normal. As you can see, all of the smooth surfaces get closer towards 1. All of the flat surfaces remain at 0 because the face normal and the vertex normal are the same. The further we get from that, i.e. the more smoothed those faces are, the more that shader starts to look. And all that is a little bit of math. That's all that. You can use this to very interesting results. This is just a few little math to help the game sliders know what to do. But if I plug this all back in, it's quite a nice effect, if I do say so myself. You don't necessarily need to bake up thousands and thousands of textures if all you need is a simple mask. A little bit of math can go a long way. Example number 2. Going on a bear hunt. There's a reference. Or how to get around tech debt. I'm going to show you an example where I had to do things a little unorthodox. Load up basic assistant level here in the background. Juggling computers, who knows what else. Okay. Itchy, excuse me. I had a task. I'm working on a car game. Cars have indicators, which means I have to make indicators. The problem with that is one of the optimizations we made is that only half of the car exists. The other half of the car is just duplicated geometry. It's not a duplicated mesh or object, just the vertices and faces and UVs get swapped. So I can't just assign two materials to each of the different indicators. I can't turn the left indicator on and have the right indicator off, because it's the same shader, same material. I can't use textures for that. I had to find another way. I'm going to show you how I did that. Go back over here. If I was very clever, I would have been clicking these buttons while I was talking, but I can't do that. I'm not that smart. Oh, and again, I haven't pressed the right button. I've got to have my face here. There we go. Okay. Indicators. Let's say I want to turn these on. Turn them up and turn the flashing off so it looks better. How do I get one half to stay on while the other half is off if the other half doesn't technically exist? This isn't technically a separate object, it's the same object. Because we're doing lots of fancy things to conform shapes to other shapes. Instead of doing things twice, why not simply mirror everything? So it's not a separate object, so I can't apply a separate material to it. I have to find another way around that. And then there's the other edge case. Okay, even if I could assign separate materials to these, what happens if I stick one in the middle? Now I've got one object that's meant to be bright on one side and not the other. How do you do that? I'll show you how. It's one of these materials. Where am I? Here. This is the hideously complicated light shader. But I'll go into more depth later, but right now I want to focus on this function. If I go into this function, the output of this, all of these nodes, just gives me a 1 or a 0. That's it. If I look down here, this is where it all starts. This is very clever and very simple, and I love it. Again, absolute world position. All this is what is the world position of the current pixel I am trying to draw? If I minus this car position vector, this vector is set by the car whenever the car gets moved. So as soon as you put the car here, this material gets told where the car is, which is this pivot point. What have I done with it? Where's my camera? And why is it over there? I clicked on this. That pivot point. There we go. In there. I don't know if you can see that very well. You really can't see that at all. That is tiny. There we go. Little itty bitty gizmo. Showing you where the car is. Just that position. That's what that vector is. So if we subtract the current pixel position, subtract the car position from the current pixel position, what we get is a vector from the currently drawn pixel to where the car is, which you can think of like a direction vector. Whereas given car, where is pixel? If we do a dot product of that from the right direction of the car, which we look at the car top down, that's right, that way, right. In our case, that's negative x, because we started making this game in a different game engine, and tech debt from 10 years ago is still there. So negative x is right in our case, but it doesn't matter. If we dot product the direction that the car is facing, in this case the direction that the right of the car is facing, from dot product that against the vector between the currently drawn pixel and the center of the car, what we get is a 1 or a 0. Or actually, in this case, what we get is a 1 or a negative 1. But in terms of pixels, negative 1 just gets clamped to 0, because how do you draw a negative light value? We don't have black torches yet. That'd be really cool, though. The sign simply says, just give me a negative 1 or a positive 1. What I'm doing is just multiplying that by this scalar value. This scalar value gets set by the game whenever I choose to turn on the left indicator or to turn on the right indicator or to turn on both of the indicators. As I've commented here, it outputs a 0 if neither of them are turned on. This value is a negative 1 if only the right indicator is on. It outputs a positive 1 if only the left indicator is on, and a value of 2 if both of them are on. Now, if you know basic math, this outputs a negative 1 or a positive 1, depending on which side of the car it's on. A negative number times a negative number is a positive number, and a negative number times a positive number is a negative number. Which means if this value is a 1, this left side is 1, and the right side is negative 1. If this value is negative 1, it's the other way around. This side becomes 0, and this side becomes 1. If I saturate it, that is, otherwise it's negative 1 and positive 1. But saturate just clamps it to 0. It's simple, and it's free. Just use saturate. It's great. And with that simple little bit of math, I am able to have half of the indicator on, and only half of the indicator on, regardless of where the car is or where the headlight is. The rest of this just handles some, the light turning on and flashing. There's some other things, whether it's on the front or the back of the car, but that's just a duplicate of this bottom code. There's some things in here for thumbnails. You don't need to worry about that. All that matters is this multiply by. If I preview that, it's going to output a 0 because that's 0. If I put it to 1, it's a 1 on one side and a 0 on the other. If I put it to negative 1, it flips it around. Look, there we go. It's very handy. And it means I can do things like having a single object in the center of the car that is lit only on one side. I'm very proud of that. But yeah, that was the second example. Example number 3. Defeat Jaggies with this one simple trick. If you're making a leaf texture or any kind of alpha mask, maybe you're drawing a smiley face or you have a decal or something, it doesn't need to be a really big texture. Even if you want the edges to be smooth, it doesn't have to be a big texture. I'm going to show you a simple trick to save a lot of GPU memory by having a really small texture that looks really crisp. You might have heard this term before, SDF, or Signed Distance Field. It sounds complicated, but it really isn't. It's, in effect, just a blurry texture. It's not a blurry texture, it's a distance field. Every pixel in the texture represents the distance to the nearest set. It's a blurry texture. And by blurring the texture, you can make it look sharper. Because when you think about it, that's all anti-aliasing is, right? Instead of having a 1 or a 0, you can have gradations between 1 or 0 to trick the eye into making it look like a smooth object or a nice crisp object without the hard jaggies. And all you're doing is blurring it. We're just going to blur it a little bit more than anti-aliasing would. And because you can make it sharper that way, it means you can shrink the texture's size down. Instead of being a 1K or a 2K alpha map, you can use a 256 pixel alpha map. And they're very easy to make. I'll show you an example. If I jump back over to here, I'm going to reset my camera, and I'm going to look at this hella cool little flame decal. I might put it somewhere where it's easy to see. Stick it up on the window here. I want you to look very closely and try and guess how many pixels of resolution this is. Because this is an alpha map. This isn't geometry. I can get right up to the clipping plane of the camera before I can see any pixels. And to prove that it's geometry, it's a lot of geometry, but that's because of other limitations that we have, right? This object needs to have a lot of geometry because I can stick it on a curved surface and it'll curve nicely to it. But it is just a flat plane. It's got an alpha texture on it. You might be thinking, okay, it'll have to be a really high resolution alpha texture to get nice smooth edges like that. But no, this is a 256 by 256 pixel image. In fact, I exported it to Affinity Photo. Here you go. Those are the pixels. We're looking at the same thing here. These smooth edges, giant pixels. It's great. Press some buttons, clicking on things. I'll open up this material. Here it is. Again, you can get really close. You won't see the pixels because the texture is blurry. It's got a really nice hard edge with no jaggies because it's a low resolution blurry image. Yeah. It's very simple. If I follow this opacity mask input, this is just some boilerplate things. All that really matters is this. I've got a texture input. I'm doing a compare against a value between 0 and 1, and I'm just outputting a value that is either 1 or 0. If you view this on a plane, nice hard edges with no pixels. All of that from a blurry texture. All you got to do is blur the texture and then do a little if statement, and you can make an interesting shape. And they're very easy to make. I jumped over here into Substance Designer. Here's a star. Big jaggy pixels. But if I blur it a little bit, with, in this case, I'm just blurring it, this output can then be used as a distance field. It's not technically a distance field, but it doesn't matter it still works perfectly fine. And it creates these nice hard edges that look really crisp. And this is just a 256 pixel texture. You don't have to use gigantic textures if you know just a little bit of shader trickery. Example number 4. How to do transparency without doing transparency. Transparency has a few limitations. I'm going to show you how to get around those limitations or do it for optimization reasons. You know, transparency is an entirely second render pass over your image. If you've got a lot of water in your game or your rendered image, maybe you don't want to do it with transparency because it's expensive. I'm going to show you how to do that. Whoop. I'm clicking the wrong buttons in the wrong order. There we go. Transparent rendering sucks. This is just an inherent truth of game development and real-time rendering. You've got limited refraction, especially on Unreal with a deferred render path. You've only got the current pixels on screen. You can't have a refracting object that refracts something that's not visible because the information just doesn't exist. You've got limited specular reflection for the same problem. The specular passes just don't exist in Unreal. For the transparent pass, it would require a lot of extra deferred rendering passes that would absolutely tank performance. And especially in our use case, with what I needed to do with a lot of transparency, it's got limited diffuse interreflection, which is a fun term. And that basically just means that when you shine a light into a transparent but like rough object, that light bounces around inside the object and makes it look like it's glowing. It's not light shining through the object so much as the light causes the object to become illuminated. It's how I get my shaders for the car lights to look really fancy, and I'll show you how I'm doing that. I've got 2 scenarios. That'll be the second one. The first, I'm going to show you how to do some shallow water. I've got a scene here where... Oh, shallow water. Yes, here we go. I've got a scene... Oh, I'm running out of breath. We're at the 35-minute mark here. Oof. Shallow water scene. Yes. Water covers a lot of it. And instead of making the GPU render the entire scene twice for that transparent object, I just chose not to do it that way. I did it in the shader. Jump over here again. Oh, press buttons in the right order. Excuse me. This shader here. What am I looking at? This one. There we go. Let's bring it into focus. There we are. You can actually see what's going on now. This whole scene is covered in water. If I were to do that with transparency, that would be a lot of extra pixels to render. So for performance reasons, I chose not to do this with transparency. The waves here crashing against the rocks are not actually crashing against the rocks. Wow, I'm running out of texture memory. I had this scene open just before. Close some windows, see what happens. Oh my god. I'm good at my job. There we go. Getting some pixels back. Yeah, instead of doing this with transparency, because the water is so shallow, I was able to get away with doing this using Unreal's built-in clear coat shading model, which is an interesting shading model in that it has two normal inputs. You can see here the light is bouncing off the water, but it's also bouncing off the rocks under the water. And because I'm not using transparency, this water also has really nice specular reflections. That's not something you can do if this was a transparent object, not without ray tracing it. No, not everyone wants to ray trace everything. Buttons. This one and then that one. There we go. I'm going to open this level up for you. That one. Of course, I parallax mapped the rocks as well because I could, right? This isn't geometry. These are the pixels. Other than the skybox, there's a single plane. And it's just the default Unreal plane. But because I know the exact specifications of what this is going to render, where's the center of my camera? I want it somewhere where I can use it. There we go. Struggling. There we go. Okay. Because I know exactly what's going to be rendered, I can make the rocks with parallax occlusion mapping and then get the waves to work with a clear coat shading model. If I open that up, go through layers to get to the parent material here. There we are. Preview isn't exactly the prettiest shader in the world, but that doesn't matter. All we're doing here is a lerp between two material attributes, which, I mean, I can do that better with blend material attributes. Where's that layer called? I know it exists. Give it to me. Blend material attributes, right at the top. I could have simply used that, but I made this shader before that node existed, so couldn't use that. But all it's doing, I've got a rock shader. All this does is make rocks. Again, not the prettiest rocks in the world. And then there's another one here. This one just makes water. And I'm blending between water and rocks just by this mask. If I output this to base color, wait for the shaders to compile. All that is a mask telling me, based on a height map texture, where my water level is. Everything above the water is black, everything below the water is white. Wrong mouse. And then I'm just blending between those two material attributes. And the reason I can get away with it is because in Unreal, you can define the shading model per pixel, which is really fun. So I'm using this exact mask to select either the default lit shading model, which is what I use for the rocks, or the clear coat shading model, which is what I use for the water. That way I can have the water normal with the rock normal below it. And I don't actually have to even know how to parallax occlusion map, because all of that is handled by another node that already exists in Unreal. This looks a lot more complicated than it is, partly because it's a lot of spaghetti. But at the end of the day, I'll plug these values back in. That goes there. At the end of the day, when we wait for the shaders to compile, what we end up with is some really nice looking rocks. And we don't have to use transparency because of the limitations because we know exactly how and where the transparency is going to be, so we can just do that math ourselves. The second example I want to show is the car headlights. If I load base persistent back up again, the car headlights that we made, again, transparency has its limitations. Diffuse interreflection was really important to get car headlights looking right, because when the lamp behind the headlight glass turns on, all of the headlight glass becomes illuminated. And that's just not something that you can do with the built-in transparency systems inside Unreal. So again, I'm going to load up my test car. Not a lot of these would be possible to do with the built-in transparency system. So I had to roll my own version of transparency. And I did this entirely inside Unreal's material editor. I didn't do any custom engine modifications or anything. If I open that shader up for you, textures, materials, that one. The really interesting way that I did transparency in here is follow the normal, not ray traced version. The opacity output here, other than the boilerplate code that we need to get things to work, is a maximum of either a value of 1 or the scene color. Which means the minimum amount of transparency this object can be is fully opaque. And yet, you can see through it, right? These trees and that building are tinted orange. How am I getting them to be tinted orange if this is so opaque you shouldn't be able to see through it? And the scene color here, all that means is that if something is blooming behind it, if there's a really bright object behind it, then the opacity value becomes above 1, which is kind of required to get bloom to work in Unreal, because otherwise, press buttons in the right order, if I turn these on, the bloom that you get from these, this like nice haloing effect, just wouldn't be possible. So that's why the max of scene color is required. Otherwise, I could just plug the number 1 in there. If I didn't want bloom, that would be all that would be required. But I do want bloom, so I needed to do the scene color. The only reason this shader is transparent is because I want to sample, where am I looking? I'm over here. I wanted to sample some of the G buffers that Unreal creates once it's finished rendering the scene and just before it finishes rendering the transparent objects. It does those in order, but it does them all on top of the base rendering pass. And so by setting this shader to transparent and then giving it a fully opaque value into its opacity, we are bypassing the shader blending logic that Unreal does by default to get transparency working, and instead it just renders it as effectively an opaque shader with the limitations of transparency. But what it gives me is these scene texture nodes. I can access all of the G buffer passes that are created as part of the default rendering pass. I can access the scene depth or the specular color of the rendered objects behind it, or the metallic value of all the rendered objects behind it. In this case, I'm sampling the base color, and that's actually the low quality version. The high quality version effectively does the same scene color node, but inside some custom HLSL. I won't go in depth into how this works, but it's essentially a spiral blur. So it samples every pixel as well as every adjacent pixel out to a certain range. So it blurs the resulting image. And that is how I am able to get the difference between these two lights. In the one on the right here, I'm not blurring that image at all. And so it's just passing through a single pass of that G-buffer texture. But for the one on the left, by sampling that texture many times in a spiral blur pattern, I can get this blurred shape. And again, for this one up here, this is a really extreme example. This is actually transparent. It's just very, 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 very blurry. But it looks really nice. And because I then, once I've sampled those textures, I can perform the math that I need to do on it. I can say, okay, for the normal map on the glass, I want the areas that are pointing, that are pointing out, that aren't pointing straight out of the normal texture. They have some offset to them, I guess. I can perform different blending amounts. I can darken or desaturate the background image or oversaturate the background image to fake the effect of that light having to pass through more of the glass. That's how I'm able to get these really dark patches and the really light patches here, because I can perform that math using just really simple, where am I over here? All it's doing is this. Just this bit here. The input image comes in, it gets multiplied by a value, and that value is itself determined by, follow this all the way down, the normal map and the height map. And so that way I can darken or brighten the middle parts or the edge parts of the texture. Again, here's a great example. You'd barely think this was transparent, but it is, and that's how I'm able to get that really, really nice color variation. By bypassing Unreal's built-in transparency and doing some fairly simple math, right? This is really all the transparency does. The glass color gets adjusted a little bit. The G-buffer passes that return the base color and the final scene color get multiplied, desaturated, and all sorts of other contrast applications applied to it. And then I'm just lerping between them based on my opacity. It's really not that complicated. There's just a lot of edge cases. That's what a lot of these are, is edge cases. These output, if I preview them, I'm not sure if this will work because they are sampling scene color and things, and that doesn't like to work. But how far back do I have to go to get this to work nicely, I wonder? It's not going to work. Anyway, yes. By doing things myself, I'm able to make them look a little bit nicer. The one side effect, unfortunately, of doing it this way, where I'm sampling the scene texture, is that only happens once. all of the transparent layers that Unreal does, if I zoom out, you can see on the side here, I've got a window looking into sort of this office space. And then I'll use a different camera. There we go. Okay. Windows looking into the office space, and then through that, I've got windows looking into the engine room here. Unreal can do its own fancy things with layering those on top of each other, but I can't do that myself without going into the engine code. So all I have access to is a single layer of transparency. I would end up with Z fighting, where this glass would try and render itself on top of this other glass sometimes. So we had to do very specific things on the bulbs here. If you look at these two, there's like a transparent bulb behind the glass. We had to do some very interesting things to get around that. It's not actually transparent. I know. 3 times. It's not actually transparent. But it looks transparent. And the way I'm doing that, if any of you have watched Chris Murphy's workshops that he loves to do, he loves going on about temporal anti-aliasing. Look, that was my mouse hitting my keyboard. I go back to here. Where am I looking? Wrong shader. That's the glass. I want to look at the thing behind the glass. Different shader. This one. If we look at this shader, it's not actually opaque. It's only using an opacity mask. And that's how I'm able to get a second layer of transparency behind the transparent object. It's not actually transparent. It just has an opacity mask. And the magic I'm doing here, this is just some blending to get things to work for our edge cases. All we're really doing, if I preview this dither temporal AA, is this mask. Go to unlit. That's all it's outputting. It's either a 1 or a 0, and I've got some Fresnel effect happening, so it's darker in the middle and lighter around the edges. This mask is all I'm using to dither the opacity mask of this texture. So all this is a dithered shader. But because of how temporal anti-aliasing works, it's sort of, it blends the last few frames together. It uses some other information like the vector motion passes, so that, like, for instance, if you were to pan across the car here, you wouldn't see ghost images of the car along the side. But it's very useful inside a shader because it will blend those last few frames together. And so this looks transparent because it's technically transparent in that it's blending the past few frames together, and some of those frames are the background and some of them are the foreground. But it's a very clever little hack to get another layer of transparency where it would otherwise not be able to be done. Oh, camera. I'm trying. It's thinking. Ugh. Yeah, that's how I'm able to get this nice orange light to be behind the glass, is by making it transparent without making it transparent. Hit the right button this time. There we go. I can turn them on. So doing my own version of transparency is what lets these lights light up the way that they light up. Unreal's built-in transparency would not be able to handle this color transition and the fact that these are bright red around the edges, or the fact that this otherwise white glass is now a glowing yellow. all because I'm doing transparency without doing transparency. Where's my mouse? There we go, it turned off. Oh, it's still turning off. Give it back to me. There we go. Okay. So, this was meant to be a 30-minute talk. I have now rambled for close to an hour. I do apologize for that. But hopefully you learned a thing or two. I might have glossed over things a little bit. I could have gone a little bit more in depth, but then, this would have gone on and on and on and on. This could be 4 hours long if I wanted it to, and I would still have things to gush about, because it's really simple math that you're just doing lots of. And you can do some really clever things that way. And hopefully this might inspire you to delve a little bit more into shaders, do things your own way, find other ways around problems. You don't have to bake textures for every mesh you want to make. You can get away with just doing it in the shader. But I'm going to end it now before we hit the 60-minute mark. Thank you for listening if you've made it all the way through. If you've got any questions, you can catch me on Twitter at @JustHannahGrace, and I'm going to awkwardly stop talking now. Thank you.